My name is John Johnson, and I'm here today with Vincent Saint. We are both process safety engineers here at Risk Management Professionals. Our topic of discussion today is going to be compliance audits with a focus on ensuring the viability of a living program. And the reason I wanted to make that our focus today, I was thinking a lot lately about the compliance audits and why a lot of our clients need to do them. So typically it is to maintain the viability of your safety program, but I also think of this as somewhat of an interface between what's going on at a particular site with a regulated chemical and the regulators and the government agencies who oversee those programs. Another way I think of it, though, is it also provides a good snapshot of what's going on the ground to the stakeholders and management who might have an interest in ensuring that that safety program is being implemented properly. So, and of course, we refer to it as a living program because over time your facility changes, your process changes, new equipment comes and goes, new personnel comes on site, and so it is a living program. It changes over time, and once again, these audits every 3 years are how you ensure that you're maintaining this program even as the facility and the process grows. Okay, so this slide, I'm sure a lot of you viewing this presentation are familiar with RMP and what we do. This slide is a breakdown of what we consider some of our core competencies. If you'd like more information, I encourage you to take a look at our website, rmpcorp.com, and of course you can give any of us a call to discuss any of the projects we do and see if we can help you out when you need it. All right, so ensuring the viability of a living program. So obviously our focus today is going to be on compliance audit. Most of you viewing this webcast are because you're aware of the regulatory requirements dictating that every 3 years you need to do an audit of your regulated process. If somehow you're unaware of what a compliance audit is, it's an evaluation to verify that the procedures and practices as stipulated by the applicable regulatory authority are being followed. So the regulatory authorities are federal agencies. So EPA has got its risk management program. OSHA has the process safety management program, and there's also state level programs. We have the California Accidental Release Prevention Program out here in California. There's CAP in Nevada, TCPA in New Jersey, and of course in California we even have certain counties have different municipal enforcement policies. So these compliance audits meet a number of different regulatory authority compliance requirements all at the same time. So the webinar topic. So the way we've divided up this webinar is that I will discuss the overall audit process. For me, this is kind of a very big subject. These audits take time, they cost money, they're going to pull valuable assets out of the field and then make them hang out with me for a week or a couple days or so. And this is always depending on the size of your facility. Experience has taught me a few ways to get the most out of the time I have allotted for the audits. So to that end, I'm going to be looking at the overall audit procedure. I'm going to be looking at the preparation, the implementation, and the finalization of these audits, and what I typically do to make sure we're using the time in the wisest fashion possible. One final note is a shout out to the CCPS guidelines for auditing process safety management systems. It's the book up here in the corner. So a lot of this presentation is going to be colored by my experience, but honestly I use this book a lot as reference material, and if you really want to deep dive into audits and procedures for doing audits, I do suggest taking a look at this. So the overview of the client's audit requirements, these are the legal requirements, and they're pretty basic. You want to certify the evaluation of compliance, and that's just a fancy way of saying do a compliance audit every 3 years. The compliance audit shall include one person knowledgeable in the process. So what I like to point out here is this is one person knowledgeable in the process being audited, not knowledgeable in the process of auditing. I know it sounds intuitive, but I have seen actually a lot of confusion with regard to that point. Document the findings. So 40 CFR Part 68 from the EPA's Risk Management Program states the owner or operator shall develop a report of audit findings. So one point of confusion I often encounter is the difference between findings and recommendations. So I want to point that out here. Findings are finding. Findings can be good, findings can be bad. Actually, I try not to use qualitative terms. So findings can say what's missing, and findings can point out what's happening at a facility. What findings also point out are deficiencies. If you have a list of deficiencies, that is what you make recommendations to fix. So speaking of deficiencies, The owner-operator shall promptly determine and document an appropriate response to each of the findings of the compliance audit and document the deficiencies. So that's typical what we call recommendations, so we call action items. It's a term fed over from HAZOP, but it really is, you have findings and a list of deficiencies and how you're going to fix those deficiencies. Finally, retain 2 of the most recent compliance audits. This is just a simple overlap table. As I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of overlap between federal programs and the state programs, and it's not just with the audits. If you look at this list, you can see that a lot of the PSM elements are similar across each individual PSM element. And I say PSM, but I'm really just referring to the generic safety management system, whether it's RMP, PSM, or CalARP. So without further ado, let's get into it. Like I said, I want to discuss how I usually approach these audits. So as I mentioned earlier, my portion of this presentation is going to be the overall performance of the audit. So if any of you ever had RMP do a compliance audit for you, you might recognize some of these items. It's typically how we break down our cost summaries. We're going to have a preparation section, we're going to have implementation and finalization. Those are what we consider our core tasks when we do a compliance audit. So as far as preparation goes, preparation for me has grown over the years as I've got more experience and to become a very core part of my audits. So a lot of what I'm doing is before I even touch ground at the facility. So first off thing I'm going to do an information request. And I usually try to get this out 3 to 4 weeks prior to the audit starting. One thing I should note, the way we attack these audits is heavily dependent on the size of the facility that needs the audit. So for example, a small water treatment plant or a simple injection process like plating or SCRs, TDI, you usually just need a single auditor for a day and a half. However, for refineries, some of the heavy industry facilities, we'll typically send a team of 2 to 3 auditors. And a lot of times these will be leading teams of facility personnel. So there can be quite a large number of personnel involved in these audits. So obviously planning and information I can get ahead of time is really going to make the audit process a lot smoother. So first off, we want to take a look at what chemicals are on site. It's probably already been discussed. We probably got a good idea, but I like to make it official. Get a list of chemicals. As part of our audits, we are looking at general applicability. So this is just our second check to make sure that the program you have implemented is actually proper for the chemicals you have in site based on threshold quantities and what the chemicals are. We also want to look at the facilities, the company policy. So not only are we auditing against the regulatory framework and the regulatory programs, we want to look at what the corporate policies are and audit against those as well. So to that end, I'll usually ask you for, what is your compliance audit policy? What's your PHA, your MOC, all those things that typically have some sort of company standard policy, we're going to audit against those as well. Plot plans, P&IDs, and PFDs. So these go heavily towards my planning strategy. And even if you're a small facility, so if you just have a single unit system, I'm going to look at the P&IDs, and before I even get on the ground, I'm going to go, you know what, this will take me a couple hours to walk down because I really want to check the P&IDs. It'll give me an idea of how many operators you have, even though I'll probably ask for that list as well. And it's going to help me game plan before I even get to your facility what's going on. For a larger facility, obviously these plot plans are going to help me divvy up units based on complexity between the 3 auditors and try to get a game plan before we even get there on how the team will be looking at these units. And also I want to look at the list of units currently undergoing turnaround or otherwise inaccessible. Obviously if you have a turnaround going, we do want to stay out of your way, but turnaround is also a really good time for us to observe safe work practices. So if you have a turnaround going, that's typically, you'll probably see confined space, permits being issued, hot work, so it kind of is something, if we can, we'd like to observe. Continuing with the information request, we also want to get a hold of your procedures for inspection, testing, and maintenance of equipment. So remember, this is an information request. You sometimes won't be able to send me everything. So for instance, if your manuals are paper, it's probably not that easy to ship them all to the RMP offices. But I'll take what I can get, and the more I can get, the easier the audit will be when we're on site. Previous incident reports. So this has a twofold help. It's good for planning, because if you have a previous incident on a unit or at the facility, it's going to really help me focus on what might have been a problem area before, and I can try to develop what the root cause was if it stemmed from your implementation of the safety program. Also though, you know, these forms, the way they're set up, so the dates that are required, the signatures that are required, the description of the incident are actually all stated on how to do it within the PSM programs themselves. So I can kind of audit that before I'm even on site and not waste time with your personnel. Instead, I can focus on the actual incidents that have occurred and see how they're being filled out. Facility organizational chart and safe work practices. Once again, this is just, they're items I can easily audit before I'm on the ground at your facility. Process safety information. So typically the PSI is one of the elements that takes up one of the largest chunks of time allocated for those audits. The thing about the PSI, it's usually documentation. This is something I can really do easily off-site. So I might as well get that work done here in the office. I can look at your event calculations, compare those to P&IDs in your equipment list. I can look at the safe upper and lower limits and make sure they at least exist for all the equipment you have on site. And when I'm on site, I talk to the operators and go, hey, do the numbers match? So at that point, I've knocked out a lot of the audit work before I'm on site and taking up your operator's busy time. PPE requirements, that's just for us. I would like to make sure I am wearing the right PPE. I want to meet your company standards, and I also do not like getting hurt. So I will ask for that list. Copies of previous audits, both internal and from any administering agency. This is all about focus and planning again. This is going to tell me where the holes are. You know, typically audit to audit, you will see a lot of the same things happening over and over again. This is how I can address it if you guys are making the proper recommendations and implementing procedures to make sure you close out these audit recommendations. Also, as part of preparation, as I said earlier, planning and scheduling. So the information request I just went through, it's a wish list. But the more information I get ahead of time, the more time I can spend on the ground observing operators, walking P&IDs, and interviewing personnel. And that list also, I mean, even though it took 3 slides, that was maybe 50%. There is a lot more information that I would ask for ahead of time, training records and policies. Like I said, everything I can get done ahead of time, the better. So this scheduling is usually something I'll do 2 to 3 weeks prior to the audit. And that's because, as I said earlier, my audit is going to take your valuable personnel out of the field and have them hanging out with me. So what I want to do is let you know ahead of time, here's who I'm going to need. You will have to find someone else to take over for them in the field, because these audits, if you lose that person over and over again during the scope, it really extends the time, sometimes by days, and we really are trying to operate within a budget. Something else I want to say, these audits, they're not just paper pushing exercises. You know, you're not just going somewhere and opening a binder and taking a look at documents. I mean, you need to interface with the personnel. You need to have interviews with the personnel. You need to walk around. You need to look. You need to audit. As I said earlier, this is not just for the regulator. This is for the company to know how the safety program is being implemented. So you're trying to find holes in a setting where I'm not going to find you. You know, I'm not going to ding you for something. I'm going to give you a list of, hey, here's your holes. Take care of this before someone who is an authority actually comes in and can have issues with your program. So as I said earlier, planning and scheduling, it's going to be greatly affected by the size of the facility and the process being audited. And these are a lot of determinations I'll make ahead of time using the plot plans and the drawings and your older audits. One thing real quick I want to point out, also before I ever get there, I will send the client an audit protocol detail. And I know in this presentation I'm referring to I and we and us a lot, which is the implication that RMP is doing your audit. But when we do these webinars, we're trying to disseminate information. So when I say I or we, take that as whoever the auditor is, whether it's internal, whether it's another firm, whoever's doing this, take these lessons and just make sure it's getting done properly. So the audit plan that you should receive from whoever's doing your audit should give you a couple pieces of simple information. What's the protocol? What's the methodology that the team is using? Are they doing sampling? For a bigger facility, you typically need to do sampling. For 100% audit of a refinery, that could take multiple months. You typically have a team in a week. So you're going to use a sampling methodology to look at a certain percentage of procedures, a certain percentage of personnel are going to be interviewed, and you're going to apply that to the facility as a whole. So I send out my sample methodologies. I like to agree ahead of time with the facility. I'm doing 50% sampling. I'm doing 75, whatever they feel comfortable with. I also want to give them the list of personnel to be interviewed. Once again, I might be taking personnel out of the field. Let them know ahead of time, hey, I might be talking to this operator of this unit for an hour or two on this day. Let them know the units I want to walk down. There's planning in there. Once again, I want to know what is inaccessible. I would like to get a list to the client of the records to be reviewed. It just makes it easier if they can have pulled a lot of these documents, especially if it requires digital access well before I even get on site. And finally, as part of the preparation stage, I've mentioned this a couple times, off-site auditing. So whatever documents I get ahead of time, I'm going to audit. So before I even set foot on the ground, I'll probably have already started filling out my worksheets. It'll have told me where I need to focus, and it'll give me remaining questions I need to answer. So it's going to give me focus during my on-site portion of the audit. Overall, that does help to reduce the expenses associated with this on-site work. If you're local, obviously it's not that big a deal. I can come and go as needed. But if I'm traveling, there's lodging, there's meals. So the more I get done off-site, the cheaper it ends up being at the end, and I can still do a good on-site portion of the audit. All right, so the implementation. So now I'm doing the audit. So I've done all my prep. I've gone to wherever the facility is, so now I'm there. We're about to start the audit. So the first thing I want to do is I want to have a meeting with all the personnel who are involved in the audit. First off, I want to meet everybody. I want to let them know what I'm doing there for the rest of the day or the week. I've noticed when I go to facilities and I'm asking for documents and asking questions and standing behind people and writing notes, I tend to make them pretty nervous. So if I introduce myself ahead of time, they know what to expect. They know I'm there as a representative of the company, and I find I get a lot better honesty and good feedback while I'm doing the audit. I also want to identify the specific owners of the individual safety programs. If you're a smaller facility, there's probably 1 or 2 persons. Large facilities can have the PSM elements spread out between 10 to 12 people. It just saves time. If I have a question, I know who to ask regarding operating procedures or employee participation, whoever is the person implementing that portion of the program at site. I also want to determine the procedures and timeline, let the team know here's my goal. Obviously these timelines can change. However, I try to give a baseline feedback of here's what I'll be doing every day. Some facilities like to do a closeout meeting every single evening, so we establish that in that kickoff meeting. I like to determine the areas of facility that I have access to. Where's my limited access? Where's my guided access? And where am I not allowed to go? If I can get this determined ahead of time, once again, it makes things just happen quicker, more quickly and smoother during the audit. So my walk down. So as I said earlier, big portions of the on-site audit are going to be personal interviews and site walk downs. So the unit walk down on the surface is, it's to verify the accuracy of the P&IDs, typically what we're doing, or maybe looking at set points on certain pieces of equipment. But the way I use my walk downs, I try to knock out a couple of different elements all at the same time. So typically if I'm walking down a unit, for a smaller facility it might be a couple hours. For a large facility it could be a couple days to walk down a unit. I'm usually with an operator guiding me. So I use this time I'll usually take out procedures with me. And so as we're walking down the P&IDs to verify their accuracy, I'll go, hey, I've got a procedure here for shutting down this pump. Can you demonstrate how you do it? And then I can kind of compare against what's happening on the ground versus what's in the documentation. So there I've kind of already started my operating procedures portion of the audit. I discussed the overall safety program. Hey, were you involved in the PHA? What did you think of the PHA? Do they solicit feedback from you when they change operating procedures? This goes to both the PHA element and the employee participation element. And it goes on. I can find out how they're implementing mechanical integrity, how the training's going. So with that one P&ID walk down, I've really got information for a lot of the other elements in my audit. Okay. So the next is the personal interviews. So as I said earlier, this is a combination of my normal conversations during the walk-downs as well as a formalized interview. So typically for an interview, I approach this for anonymity. And the reason I do that is because I really want people to be honest with me. And I found that even though at this point I've stressed I'm here as a company representative, you guys are paying me, I still find that people are nervous about saying anything that might be considered knocking against the company. So I will not typically give you the name. I'll use operator interviewed and give you the statement of what my findings were in the interview. I just want a true picture of how the facility is implementing the safety program. Of course, in a smaller facility where I have 2 operators, anonymity is not as easy, but try to take advantage of it where I can. So the worksheets. Okay. As I said earlier, this all comes down to these worksheets we're filling out. I have filled out a bunch before I even came on site. I'm filling out notes as we go through the audit. What these do is they provide regulatory verbiage, and we have space to document our findings as well as our recommendations. Here, I'll show you what one of our worksheets looks like. As I said earlier, like I said, we're disseminating this information because we want you to be able to do good audits. Whether it's R&P or someone else, this is my approach. It's an approach I've been using for a couple years, and it's an approach that I believe in. So this is the basic template we use. As you can see, we have an ID number for the element. We section off our worksheet. So we have a table that's for operating procedures, a table that's for PHA. So typically I give this an ID number. For instance, operating procedures, so it's got a 2 or 3 letter designation. In this case, OP-01 means it's the operating procedures and it's the first PSM element we're discussing. You can also see the regulatory references. This right here, this template was developed for what would be a Program 3 OSHA, EPA, CalARP covered facility. So we've got all the 4, because it includes CalOSHA as well, regulatory references. So if anyone wants to go back, they can go, hey, why did they make these certain findings? What were they looking for? Of course, to make that even easier, we include the requirement. So for instance, here, the owner, operator, employer shall develop and implement written operating procedures that provide clear instructions for safely conducting activities involved in each covered process, and it goes on. So this is copied and pasted from the regulatory verbiage. The only changes is because, as I mentioned earlier, this is multiple regulatory agencies. If you look at these a lot like I do, you'll kind of notice that OSHA always refers to the employer. You'll notice that EPA and CalARP always refer to the owner and operator, and so you can kind of see we tweak the wording to encompass everybody, to keep everyone from the agencies happy. So what I'm going to do with this worksheet is I'm going to answer this question, yes, no, partial, or not applicable. And when I make that determination, when I say yes or no, I need to put in my findings. My findings are my justification for making that determination on implementation of the program. So here's an example of a yes. So this is kind of a best case. I go in there, I take a look at this first audit element, and I say, yes, they are meeting the requirement, and here's my justification. I'm going to read, so hopefully you won't fall asleep during this. 15 of 30 procedures were reviewed, 50% sampling. Procedures were presented in a stepwise manner and included notes and cautions detailing safe operating limits of applicable equipment. PPE requirements were included on each reviewed procedure. Per interview with operator and maintenance technician, it was noted that the PPE requirements as well as safe operating limits were considered up to date and correct. Note that the safe operating limits also correspond 100% to those safe operating limits described in the PSI element. During the P&ID walkdown, operations personnel demonstrated procedures with one-to-one correspondence between observed and written procedures. As I said, that is a best case scenario. And what I also want to point out is I don't use qualitative statements. So there's no good, bad, wrong, or right. I am simply stating, this is my justification for my yes. Here's what I reviewed. Here's what I talked to. Here's who I interviewed. Here's what the personnel said. This is my justification for why I made that determination. So if we look at something that's not quite a best case, this is a partial. And you can have partials. Sometimes certain elements are followed only partially, I guess is the best way to say it. So in this case, 15 of 30 procedures were reviewed for 50% sampling. Procedures were presented in a stepwise manner. During the unit walkdown, the operator demonstrated each of the 15 reviewed procedures. However, 8 of the 15 procedures deviated from the written procedure by at least 1 or more steps. The operator noted that some of the procedures have been improved by field personnel, but that these changes must not have been captured in the written procedures. During interview with other operators, 3 out of 5, the operators concurred that changes have been made to procedures in the field. And then I make a reference to my recommendation. So I'm just making a recommendation against this facility, and it's a fairly simple recommendation just to ensure that the written operating procedures match what's being done in the field. One other thing I want to note, as I said earlier, even though I'm auditing one element in my head, I'm usually auditing multiple elements. So this would tell me, A, if the operating procedures that are being done in the field don't match the written, they're probably not doing their annual certifications. And it also says that the employee participation element's probably not being done properly because all the guys in the field know the procedure change, but whoever's handling the written did not know about it. All right, so I've done my audit, I've done my worksheets, taken my notes. Now we're going to do a closeout meeting. As I said earlier, some facilities like to do it nightly. Typically, you'll just get one big one at the very end of the audit. So what you want to do with these is review with the stakeholders at the facility. And what you really want to do is, though, is you want to get input with regards to recommendations. So, you'll sit down with the audit team, the participants, and management, and you're going to review those findings and get the input on their recommendations. So as I mentioned earlier, I made a simple recommendation for that operating procedure, the findings. And it was very simple. Ensure that all written procedures in use at the facility accurately reflect procedures performed by operations personnel. So a lot of times when I sit down with the people in the room, though, they're like, well, what are we doing? How do we manage this? And so a lot of times we'll sit down and kind of hash out recommendations that are a little bit easier to close. And by easy, I don't mean they have to do less, but I mean there's something definitive they can do that will mark a closure point on that recommendation. And I'm just using this example because it's something I've seen in the past. So we would take a recommendation like this, and we talk to the team, talk to management, talk to the stakeholders, and we'll usually flesh out that recommendation to be a little more in-depth. So we'll change it to something like this. Ensure that all written procedures in use at the facility are reviewed by appropriate personnel, operations, supervisors, etc., to verify accuracy. Any procedures noted as inaccurate by the review team should be updated following typical facility operation procedures development policies. As part of this recommendation, a list of verified and updated procedures should be compiled and approved by operations supervisor. So that, or operations supervisor, whoever holds responsibility at your facility, that's your closeout point. When that, they've been reviewed, they've gave a list of what was inaccurate, they've done the changes, and now the operations supervisor reviews it, he signs it, you can now consider that recommendation closed. Also, as part of finalization, so you've done the closeout meeting, I've left, I'm going to put together a nice little shiny report. I do prepare an executive summary, so I'm an engineer, I tend to talk in jargon, I use acronyms, I think sometimes swear people are paying me by the word. So the executive summary is going to provide a quick list of what management typically cares about. So they want to know what were the findings, how many deficiencies were there, and how many recommendations do they need to deal with. I include my methodology. This is going to go to anyone who's auditing in the future, or anyone who wants to know why I came up with the findings I came up with. Include the name of the personnel in the audit team as well as the interviewees. As I said earlier, the comments during the interview are typically anonymous, but you do want to have a list of who the personnel interviewed was. And a list of documentations that we reviewed. So as I mentioned earlier, typically if we're doing sampling, maybe we review 8 out of 10 procedures. Well, I want to provide the list of what those procedures were. If I found a deficiency, even though we apply that across the board, I want you to know where to target and where to look, once again, to justify my findings and my decision as to yes, no, or partial in this audit. So the recommendation follow-up. So typically at this point, I've turned in my report, we've had our meeting, the recommendations. This is the point where the facility follows us out long after I'm gone. And some of our active clients, yes, we'll provide input in, and yes, we'll help. But for a lot of times, this can happen a year and a half down the line. So I want to make sure that there's a clear procedure for how the facility will follow up on these recommendations long after I'm gone. So first off, during the closeout meeting, we will have assigned an individual who holds responsibility. We'll have assigned an anticipated date of completion. And as I said earlier, when these things are done, you want to mark off that this deficiency has been handled. You want to call it closed, which once again is how I referred to in that other recommendation. While you typically want your recommendations to have a closure point, some action that is taken, that means you have addressed the deficiency. This is generic recommendation action tracking log that we send out to our clients. This one, obviously, you can see, I think, is for probably our existing clients because we have recommendations for PHAs, seismics, as well as our audits. But here you can see it's got an ID number, it's got what the recommendation was, it's got closure comments, all these things that need to be filled out in order to say that the facility has addressed the deficiencies that were brought to light during the audit. So, ensuring the viability of a living program. To close out my section, I'd like to go back to my central theme. And that is to note that these audits are useful tools for looking at the information of the safety programs at your facility. We know they're done to satisfy regulatory requirements, but I would imagine that anyone who has a stakeholder in the process or in the safety of the personnel working would like to have a good idea of what holes there are in these programs, because even though it's hard to trace direct risk from implementation of these programs, you can do root cause analysis, and holes in the safety programs typically can be can be seen if you trace it back to present problems that eventually may lead to hazards and issues that we really don't want to see at our facilities. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Vincent Saint, who is going to go into a little deeper dive on the elements themselves.
Thank you, John. My name is Vincent Saint, and like John said, I will be talking more in depth about the individual program elements, what's required, what we look for during the performance of the compliance audit. Firstly, we're going to start with the general elements. This includes the submittal. This one's either for the EPA or your local regulator, your UPA, sometimes both if you're a program 3 facility. For the EPA, CDX submission is required, and that's done online. For the UPA, it tends to vary, usually depending on what they would prefer. Sometimes we just email them electronic copy, or we would send them a hard copy. Next is the management program. This is where we look at how the program is developed, implemented, and updated, as well as the responsibility, or who has the responsibility for the entire program or its individual elements. Next, we then review the hazard assessment, ensure that dispersion modeling calculations are correct, the sensitive receptors are accounted for, and that the 5-year accident history is noted. We also want to make sure that the worst and alternative release scenarios are developed. And finally, we also look at the emergency response plan or program and ensure that it is in line with what is required. This could either be an emergency action plan or an emergency response plan. The difference between the two is that an action plan just basically requires an evacuation during an emergency, and a response plan would require a little bit more of your personnel to respond to the emergency. Now let's get into the individual prevention program elements, and we're going to start off with process safety information. This is where we look for the information pertaining to the hazards of the substance. Here we typically look for the SDS, your safety data sheets for the covered chemical, and also we want to ensure that all the MSDS have been updated to SDS following the change. We then look for information pertaining to the technology of the process. This includes an overview of the process, the maximum intended inventory calculations, and your safe operating limits for all the equipment within the covered substance. We then look for information pertaining to the equipment of the process. This includes walking down your P&IDs to ensure that the updates to the system has been captured. Like John said, depending on the facility, an entire walkdown can either be completed in a few hours or a few days. But if that's not possible, representative equipment would be chosen, and the lines connected to that equipment would be reviewed to ensure that all the valves, instrumentation, etc. are present. If not, that would be noted and put as a recommendation to update the P&IDs to reflect what is currently in the system. Materials of construction, electrical classification, design codes, and standard information are also reviewed. And finally, calculations and the basis to the relief system are also looked at. Next, we have our process hazard analysis. This section is pretty straightforward. We want to ensure that the PHA has been completed within that anniversary date of 5 years, as well as the seismic assessment. We then reviewed the methodology that was used and the team that was present during the PHA. Basically, we want to make sure that the team consisted of a person knowledgeable in the process and a facilitator knowledgeable in the methodology that was being used. We also want to ensure that all recommendations from the previous PHA has been closed out in a timely manner, or 2.5 years in California. And also we want to check if a revalidation has been done every other 5 years. For the operating procedure, this audit will include all of the applicable steps for each operating phase as required by the regulations. It's important to note that not all facilities may have operating phases, but as long as documentation is provided with the reason for the missing phase, it should be fine. For example, water treatment facilities typically operate 24/7, so this continuous operation means that they would have an initial startup, but not necessarily a normal startup. And then we would verify the operating procedures. So usually we do this by picking a representative procedure. Like John said, if there's not enough time to review all of them, we'd pick one. We'd ask the facility which procedure they use most frequently, and then we would go walk down to the site and ask the operator to perform the procedure while we verify each of the steps on the written procedure. And we also want to ensure that the procedure is being reviewed annually and is documented, is documented by using a sign-off sheet with the date and signature of the reviewer. Next, we have the training section. Here, we ensure that the training program is in place and that the requirements are being met. We check for the procedures on whether the initial and refresher training on the operating procedures, the maintenance procedures, the hazards of the covered substance information, and the safety program training are being performed. We verify this by looking at the completed training forms, and we also check for verification on whether personnel understood the topics of the training. These are usually either done in verbal, a written test, observation, or a combination of either of the three. For the mechanical integrity program, we pretty much make sure that all the equipment that is part of the regulated process is included in the PM schedule, as well as verifying that the PM schedule is in line with manufacturer recommendations, industry experience, and best practice. We also look for completed documentation pertaining to the maintenance, sample work orders, as well as procedures for correcting equipment deficiencies, and also the procedures on how to perform the applicable maintenance tasks on the PM schedule. Next, we have the management of change. So here, we basically just look at the procedures on when an MOC is required, how to perform an MOC, also completed MOC forms, if any, and any tracking follow-up items after an MOC has been completed, such as training on new procedures if applicable, or updating the process safety information with the new equipment that has been changed. Pre-startup safety review pretty much goes in conjunction with the MOC. We check for the same thing, check for PSSR procedures, any completed PSSR forms, and the follow-up items after the PSSR is completed. Then we have the compliance audits. Pretty much we review the audits. We ensure that the audits are being performed every 3 years. Also, we check that the list of participants in the compliance audit are documented. We also want to review the recommendations from the previous audit and ensure that it has been completed and closed out. If not, we carry these recommendations over to the current compliance audit and add it to our action tracking log. Ideally, you would want the recommendation completed and closed out within 1.5 years for California, or in a timely manner per EPA RFP. Next, we have our incident investigation audit, which includes a review of the incident investigation procedures and how it's implemented. So here, we make sure that the requirements are met both in documentation and in practice. Pretty much includes initiating the investigation within 48 hours of the incident, ensure appropriate team members are included, and the development of the report and communication to affected personnel. We also want to ensure that these completed forms are kept by the facility for 5 years. Next, we have the employee participation section. This audit consists of reviewing the procedures for implementing this section. We want to ensure that the procedures outline that employees participate in the development, implementation, and update of the safety program. We achieve this by interviewing operators and asking if they have access to the safety program, if they are knowledgeable in the individual elements, specifically the PHA. Next, we have the hot work permit. Here we check for the procedures and how to initiate a hot work permit, which would include the authorizations needed and necessary precautions on getting the work done. We also look for completed hot work permits, if any, to verify if the procedures are being followed as it was written. Lastly, we have the contractor section. This includes verifying the contractor forms, ensuring the procedure outlines the necessary requirements, including evaluation of the contractors prior to hiring and periodically after. We also want to check that the procedures for informing the contractors of the hazards of the covered substance is included. These are the common deficiencies and misconceptions that we have encountered during our time working with different facilities. First, the mechanical integrity documentation is lacking. There's no work orders on file, or inspection reports are not there that shows that the equipment is being maintained. Next, the training documentation. The training section is missing documentation, especially those training that's resulting from MOCs, the operating procedures, PSSRs, and incident investigation. Also, we want the operating procedures and P&ID accuracy, in addition to the PSI information. This is why it's important to walk down P&IDs and verify operating procedures during the compliance audit to be able to find these deficiencies. Like John said, we usually can't verify all of the equipment or procedures, but if half of the procedures are deficient, then chances are most probably will. Also, the most common deficiency that I've seen are from recommendation closures. The majority, if not all, of the recommendations resulting from either the PHA, the compliance audit, seismic assessment, incident investigations are not being addressed, or if they are, they're not updated as completed and closed out in the action tracking log, and there are no documentation to indicate that it has been completed. This, in essence, is the prevention program lifecycle. Stated in the title of this webinar, these are living documents. We know deficiencies will occur over time and procedures will change. But the idea is to update and follow up in order to stay compliant. We follow this cycle by first developing the program, implementing it, and ensuring that the procedures are being followed. Next, the program is evaluated and deficiencies are noted. Then we correct these deficiencies and improve the program and implement it again, and so on and so forth in the cycle. And over time, if you follow this cycle, your safety program will be working as intended. In summary, during compliance audits, we want to ensure the following: have the appropriate team, a method to document the results, ensure regulatory requirements are met, supporting documentations are reviewed, and verify program is implemented as it was written. It is also important to be objective, follow up on recommendations in a timely manner, and ensure continued compliance and safety of your personnel. These are our upcoming webinars. You can find the schedule on our website at rmpcorp.com, and you can also sign up online if you would like to view these webinars. And I'm going to open up to questions.
So we have one question. How do you determine the time required for an audit?
So as I mentioned earlier, part of the information request is looking at those plot plans, those P&IDs, PFDs. We'll usually make the determination based on the size and scope of the facility. What else to do? So let's say for a refinery, I'll typically ask for a list of units, a list of personnel. I kind of ask, hey, am I managing a team, or is it just personnel from my firm who are going to go out there, and make my determination based on that. So I typically scale it based on, like I said, operators, units, complexity. It always changes, so I can look at a simple process and look at the drawings and go, you know what, I can knock this out in a day and a half. And once again, I can look at something larger, and you know what, I'm going to need other field personnel. It can take some time. So those determinations are made based on documents provided from the potential client who needs the audit done.
Or that just came in. When making changes at your facility, you wouldn't do a full PHA. What about a condensed focused PHA?
So the question was, when making changes at your facility, you wouldn't do a full PHA. You would do a condensed, and I think the question is, what about doing a condensed PHA? I'm not sure, since we were doing this on audit, if it is, what about doing condensation of the audit, or if it is really referring to PHA. If I take the question as it stands, to me that just sounds like an MOC PHA. So if you don't do a full PHA, you do an MOC PHA, which focuses on the changes occurring, and of course how that will affect the outer scope of the process. So yeah, that would be my answer to that specific question. If somehow, another way this could be taken, since this was a compliance audit, if you're referring to, hey, can you do like an MOC or a condensed audit, typically no. So just hopefully I answered both ways you could address that question.
He said very good, thanks.
Okay.
There's another question. Do you leave any type of written report summary at the end of the closing meeting, or you only issue a formal report sometime after the field visit portion of the audit?
It depends on what the client wants. So if the client wants a formal or a report before I go, I will typically build time into that. So, when we do these audits, we're going fast. And so my language isn't greatest when I'm doing that. What I've written down is chicken scratch notes and little pieces here and there. And so we take it back to the office, we make it look really nice, complete sentences, so it's easy to read in the future. But you're right, some clients want to know what we did before we even left. And so if the client asks for it, like I said, I'll build a little bit of cleanup time during the course of the week or when I'm doing the audit. But yes, I will definitely leave it, and that's all up to the client, whatever they want. So will the slides be available? Yes, they'll be available on our website, and I believe we'll be sending a link after the presentation is over.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for watching. That is it. Thanks.